The call came at 2:47 in the morning, and I know the exact time because I still have the screenshot saved on my phone. I didn't recognize the number. Nashville area code. But not a contact I'd ever saved. My first thought, the way it always is when the phone rings in the middle of the night, was that something had happened to my daughter. I sat up in the dark and answered before the second ring finished. It wasn't a family member. It was a neighbor, a man named Harold who lived 2 doors down from my daughter's house in Nashville. He said he'd been watching her driveway for 3 days and hadn't seen a single light on inside. He said her car was there, but she wasn't answering the door. He said he almost didn't call, that he didn't want to interfere, but something felt wrong to him and he'd found my number through her landlord's emergency contact form from 2 years ago. I asked him what kind of wrong. He said, "Mom, I don't know, but the kind that keeps an old man up at night." I was out of bed before I hung up. My daughter, I'll call her by what I've always called her, my Lily, was 34 years old, a landscape architect, and had been married to her husband for 6 years. His name is Spencer. They had no children. She had called me on her birthday in September, 2 months before that night in November, and she'd sounded tired in a way I recognized but couldn't name then. Not sad, not sick, just hollowed out, like she was going through the motions of a phone call the same way you go through the motions of loading a dishwasher. You do it because it needs doing, not because you feel anything about it. I'd asked her if everything was okay. She said, "Of course, Mom, everything's fine." I believed her because I wanted to. I drove to Nashville, 8 hours from my home in Knoxville. No, I didn't fly. I thought about it, but I didn't want to wait on flights or sit still that long. I needed to be moving. I needed to feel like I was doing something. So I packed a bag in the dark, left a note on the kitchen counter for my neighbor to water the plants, and I drove. The sun came up somewhere around Cookville. I remember watching the sky turn from black to that deep bruised purple, and then to orange, and I thought about the last time I had driven to Nashville to see Lily. It had been Easter. Spencer had been charming the way he always was, pouring wine before anyone asked, making everyone laugh, keeping a hand on Lily's back that looked affectionate from across the room, but that she never leaned into. I had noticed that. I hadn't said anything. I arrived at her house at 10:30 in the morning. Harold was standing on his porch with a cup of coffee, waiting. He was in his 70s, a retired postal worker, and when he saw me pull up, he walked over before I even got out of the car. He told me he knocked again that morning and still nothing. He told me the mail was piling up. He told me quietly that he'd heard raised voices from that house back in October, once, but only once, and that Lily used to wave to him every morning when she left for work, and she hadn't done that in a while. I thanked him. Then I used the spare key Lily had given me 7 years ago, the one she'd pressed into my hand when she first moved in, and said, "Just in case, Mum, don't use it unless you have to." This was a have to. The house was dark. The curtains were all drawn. There was a smell. Not something terrible, just the particular staleness of a space that hasn't had fresh air in too long. Dishes in the sink. A glass of water on the coffee table with a ring dried into the wood beneath it. Mail on the floor inside the door. And then I heard it. A sound from upstairs, very faint, like someone breathing wrong. I took the stairs 2 at a time, which I should not do at 63 with the knees I have, and I pushed open the bedroom door. Lily was in the bed. She was awake barely. Her face was pale the way paper is pale. She looked at me and she said, "Mum," and then her eyes closed again. I called 911. I stood next to her and held her hand and talked to her until the ambulance arrived, saying the kinds of things you say when you don't know what's happening and you're terrified, but you cannot show it. Things like, "You're okay, I'm here. Everything is going to be okay." Saying it for her as much as for me. The paramedics came. They moved quickly and without drama, which scared me more than if they'd been alarmed. One of them asked me her name, her age, when I'd last spoken to her. I answered everything, And then I followed the ambulance to Vanderbilt in my own car, and I sat in the ER waiting room for 4 hours. At some point during those 4 hours, I called Spencer. He didn't answer. I called again. Voicemail. I texted, "Lily is in the hospital. Call me immediately." He read it. I could see the read receipt. He didn't call. I sat with that for a moment. Then I put my phone in my pocket and went back to waiting. The doctor who came to find me was young, younger than Lily, and she spoke to me with a careful gentleness that told me this was not a routine situation. She told me Lily had been severely dehydrated, that she had a significant infection that had gone untreated long enough to become dangerous, that she was going to be all right, but that another day or two at home would have changed that. She asked if I knew how long Lily had been symptomatic. I told her I didn't know, that I'd driven 8 hours to find her. She nodded slowly and wrote something down. I asked if I could see my daughter. She said yes. Lily was on an IV, and the colour was already coming back to her face, just slightly. She looked at me when I walked in and started to cry. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that comes out of sheer relief. I sat down beside the bed and took her hand, and I didn't ask questions yet. I just let her cry. Sometimes that's the only thing you can do. When she was calmer, I asked where Spencer was. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said he was traveling for work. I asked when he'd left. She said Thursday. It was Monday. I asked if he knew she was sick. She looked away from me, toward the window. The curtains were open and Nashville was bright outside, that particular sharp autumn light. She said, "He knew I wasn't feeling well." I did not press her. Not yet. I had learned a long time ago that you cannot push a door open that someone is holding closed from the other side. You have to wait for them to decide to let you in. I went back to the hallway and I called Spencer again. This time he answered. His voice was easy, relaxed. There was noise in the background, the kind of noise that comes from a restaurant or a bar. I told him his wife was in the hospital at Vanderbilt. I told him she was stable, but that she had been alone and very sick for at least 4 days. I told him I needed him to get on a plane. He said, "She didn't tell me it was that serious." I said, "She was too sick to tell you anything." He said he had meetings, that he'd try to get a flight by Wednesday. I stood in that hospital hallway for a moment after we hung up, looking at the floor tiles, doing the thing I'd been doing my entire adult life. The thing my own mother taught me to do, which is to count to 10 before you say the thing you want to say, because the thing you want to say is almost never the right thing. I counted to 10. Then I called my attorney. I want to explain something here because it matters. When Lily got married, I was happy for her. Spencer was educated and successful, and he was kind to her in the beginning, or he seemed to be. But 3 years into the marriage, I started to see things that worried me. Not anything dramatic, just absences. The way he was never quite present in any room he was in. The way Lily would start a sentence and then stop, like she'd thought better of it. Small things. The kind of small things that add up. When Lily turned 30, she called me and we had a long conversation, and she told me, very quietly, that she had stopped telling Spencer about problems because it was easier. I asked her what she meant. She said he didn't respond well to difficulty, that when she was struggling with something, he tended to disappear, into work, into trips, into a version of himself that was unavailable. She said she'd learned to just handle things herself. I asked if she wanted to leave him. She said no. She said she loved him. She said she just needed to figure out how to make it work. I respected that. She was a grown woman. It was her marriage. But I did do one thing. I called a family attorney, a woman I'd worked with before, and I asked her what options a mother had, legally, to protect an adult child in a situation of potential medical neglect. We had a long conversation, and then I did something that felt excessive at the time. I had Lily sign a document naming me as her emergency medical contact, and giving me medical power of attorney in the event she was incapacitated and her spouse could not be reached. We did it properly, notarized, filed correctly. Lily signed it in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning in March, over coffee. She said, "Mom, you worry too much." She was smiling when she said it. I said, "Humor me." That document sitting in my files back in Knoxville was the reason I could now walk back into my daughter's room and make decisions. I need to say clearly, I did not use it to override Lily. I used it because she was too sick to navigate paperwork and Spencer had made it clear he was not coming. I used it to get information from her doctors, to authorize her treatment, to be the person in that room making sure she was not alone. That is what it was for. That is why I had it. Spencer arrived on Wednesday evening. He came into the room with flowers, a gas station bouquet, cellophane still on, and that easy smile. He kissed Lily on the forehead. He shook my hand and said, "Thank you for being here, Helen." That was the first time in 6 years he had used my name instead of just Lily's mom. I looked at my daughter's face when he walked in. She didn't light up. She smiled, but it was the same smile she'd used on the phone in September. Going through the motions. I stayed in Nashville. I got a hotel 2 blocks from the hospital, and I came every morning and left every evening. Spencer came for a few hours each day and then went back to wherever he went. He was always pleasant. He always had a reason. On the 4th day, one of the nurses, a woman named Barbara, who had been on Lily's floor the whole week, stopped me in the hallway on my way out. She looked at me for a moment, weighing something. Then she said, "Your daughter asked me to tell you something she didn't feel like she could say in front of her husband." I stopped. Barbara said, "She wants you to know she's been sick since the week after he left, and that he called once. Just once, in 10 days. I went back to my hotel room that night and I sat at the small desk by the window and I opened my laptop and I started doing something I probably should have done 2 years ago. I started looking at their finances. Now, I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I'm not the kind of person who goes through her grown child's private affairs. I had raised Lily to be independent, to handle her own life. But she had given me access to a joint savings account years ago for emergencies, the way families sometimes do when you're not sure what tomorrow looks like. I had never touched it. I logged in that night for the first time, and I looked at what was there. The account, which had held just over $40,000 when I last saw a statement Lily had shared with me 2 years prior, now held $600. I sat very still. Then I called my attorney again. She talked me through it, step by step, what I could do, what I couldn't, what would help Lily and what would only make things harder. She told me the most important thing right now was documentation, dates, amounts, records. She told me to stop looking at the account so there was no question of interference, but to screenshot what was already there. She told me that if Lily wanted to pursue anything legally once she was well, she would have a foundation to stand on. I did exactly that. I did not confront Spencer. Not yet. I had learned, am still learning, that the impulse to confront is almost always less useful than the impulse to prepare. Lily was discharged on a Thursday morning. Spencer picked her up. I stood in the parking lot and watched them drive away, and I had a feeling I recognized from when she was small. From the first day of kindergarten, the first time I let her walk home from a friend's house alone. That feeling of watching someone you love move out of your reach and trusting the world to be gentler with them than it sometimes is. I drove back to Knoxville. 2 weeks later, Lily called me. She called on a Sunday afternoon and she talked for 2 hours. She talked about things she hadn't said out loud before, or maybe ever, in the way that illness sometimes cracks something open that had been sealed shut. She talked about how lonely the marriage had been for a long time. She talked about money she had earned and money she couldn't account for. She talked about the way Spencer would frame things, her feelings, her concerns, her needs, as overreactions, as her being too sensitive, until she had started to believe it herself. I listened, all of it. When she was done, I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want out." I said, "Okay, then let's do this the right way." I flew to Nashville the following Thursday. I brought my attorney with me. She was willing to make the trip, which told me everything about what she thought of the situation. We spent 2 days with Lily, going through what she knew, what she could document, what she wanted. We talked about the account. We talked about her options. I want to say something about what those 2 days were like, because I think it matters. There was no triumph in any of it. There was no satisfaction in watching the pieces of Lily's marriage be laid out on a table and examined like evidence. It was grief. It was the grief of watching your child have to reckon with something they should never have had to go through. I cried in the rental car on the way back to the hotel by myself, where she couldn't see. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in months, which was hope. Spencer did not take the divorce filing gracefully. He called me twice, the second time using language I won't repeat here. He told me I had interfered in his marriage. He told me I had poisoned Lily against him. He told me I had poisoned Lily against him. He told me that I would regret getting involved. I let him finish. Then I said, "Spencer, my daughter was alone and nearly septic in a dark house for 4 days while you didn't answer your phone. We're done talking." I hung up. The divorce took 14 months. Tennessee is an equitable distribution state, which means the court looks at what's fair rather than splitting everything down the middle automatically. What came out in discovery was worse than I'd let myself imagine. Spencer had been systematically transferring money from their joint accounts into a personal account in his name for nearly 3 years. The $40,000 I'd seen was already the aftermath of the first round of transfers. A forensic accountant found the rest. He also had not been on a work trip in November. I'll leave it at that. Lily got the house. She got a significant portion of the marital assets, including a portion of the depleted savings as calculated against what had been taken. She got her car, her retirement account, and her professional portfolio, which Spencer had claimed partial ownership of in the initial filing, and which the court dismissed. She also got something the court didn't give her, which was herself back. I watched it happen over months, the way she started finishing sentences again, the way she started telling me things without editing them first, the way she laughed differently, fuller, like she wasn't monitoring the room for a reaction. Last April, almost 18 months after that phone call in the night, I drove back to Nashville, not for anything difficult, just to visit. Lily had repainted the living room a color she described as aggressive yellow, and I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in years. Harold from next door came over for coffee and brought cookies and told the same postal service story he always tells, and Lily laughed at it like she was hearing it for the first time. We sat on her porch that evening, the two of us, with the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. The trees were coming into leaf. The neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods do in spring. Kids on bikes, someone mowing 2 blocks over, the smell of someone's dinner coming through an open window. Lily said, "I keep thinking about that night you showed up." I said, "Which part?" She said, "Harold calling you. The fact that someone was paying enough attention to make that call." She paused. I think about how close it was. I didn't say anything. I knew what she meant. The kind of close that you don't examine too directly because it rearranges things. She said, "Thank you for the document, Mum. The one we signed in your kitchen." I said, "You told me I worried too much." She said, "You worried exactly enough." We sat there a while longer, until the light went low and golden and then faded out. Then she went inside to make dinner, and I stayed on the porch alone for a few more minutes, looking at the quiet street, at the house with the aggressive yellow living room, at everything that had almost not been. There is a kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It signs documents on Tuesday mornings over coffee. It drives 8 hours in the dark. It sits in hospital hallways counting to 10. It doesn't need to be thanked, and it doesn't need to be right, and it doesn't need the story to be clean. It just needs to show up. And if you are a mother reading this, or watching this, and something in you has been quietly uneasy about someone you love, a child, a sister, anyone. I want you to know that the unease is worth listening to. You are not interfering. You are paying attention. And sometimes paying attention is the only thing that matters. I still think about the $600, not because of what it meant financially, but because of what it meant as a picture of a life. 40,000, methodically drained over 3 years, and Lily never said a word. Not because she didn't know something was wrong, but because she had been taught slowly and quietly to doubt her own sense of what wrong looked like. That's the thing about the kind of harm Spencer did that doesn't leave marks. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small corrections, a feeling dismissed here, a concern reframed there, until the person on the receiving end stops trusting what they feel. Lily didn't miss the signs. She'd been persuaded over years that the signs weren't signs at all. I've thought a lot about what made the difference, and I keep coming back to the same 3 things, not as a list, but as a way of understanding what held our family together when everything else was coming apart. The first is simply doing right by people when it costs you something. I didn't sign that power of attorney document with Lily because I expected to use it. I signed it because I believed that love sometimes means making a plan for the worst, even when the person you love thinks you're being dramatic. Doing right by her meant acting without an audience, without recognition, without knowing if any of it would ever matter. That's the only version of decency that means anything, the kind you practice when nobody's watching. The second is paying attention well. When Harold called me that night, he didn't know what was wrong. He just knew something was. He had been watching carefully, the way people used to watch out for each other before we all got too busy to notice our neighbors. I had been watching too, not suspiciously, but attentively. The pauses in Lily's sentences, the way she stopped talking about the future. I didn't act on any of it in time to prevent what happened, but I had been paying close enough attention that when the moment came, I knew what to do. Wisdom isn't always knowing the answers. Sometimes it's just having asked enough questions along the way that you're not starting from zero when you need to move fast. The third is staying in motion when everything in you wants to collapse. There were several moments in those 14 months, in that hospital hallway, in that hotel room looking at bank statements, in the rental car crying where Lily couldn't see, when the easier thing would have been to fall apart. I didn't fall apart. Not because I'm particularly strong, but because Lily needed someone who wasn't. You find out what you're made of, not in the moments that call for strength, but in the moments when you have no choice but to provide it anyway. Spencer lost everything in the end because what he built was built on the assumption that nobody would look closely. He was wrong. Harold looked closely. I looked closely. I looked closely. And eventually, so did a judge. Lily repainted her living room an aggressive yellow. Every time I see it, I think that is what it looks like when someone gets themselves back. I hope you never need to make an 8-hour drive in the dark for someone you love. But if you do, go. Don't wait for the right time or the full picture or the reassurance that you're not overreacting. The unease you feel about someone you love is worth more than you've been told it is. Go anyway.